Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final virtual retro seminar of this term. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation. With me today is Alan Morrison, Professor of Law and Finance here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, who co-convenes these seminars with me, and our guest speaker, Florian Wettstein. Florian is Professor of Business Ethics and Director of the Institute for Business Ethics at the University of St. Gallen. He's an expert on business ethics and human rights, and he has published very important work on the topic, including an excellent book on multinational corporations and global justice that I have been reading and rereading for the past several years. Florian is also founder and editor-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal, which is quickly becoming the reference in the field. Florian's contributions to business and human rights scholarship and practice are too many to list in a short introduction, but I'd like to highlight his dedication to the development of junior scholars, his commitment to collaboration and learning between continents, and his engagement with policymakers. We are tremendously lucky to have Florian with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to him in a moment. But before we start, I'd like to say a few quick words about the seminar. Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust, and Relationships at Oxford, is a seminar series that, as many of you, well, perhaps most of you already know, is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. This series is generously supported by the Center for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research center here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, directed by Rupert Younger. When Retro started in early 2020, it was an Oxford-based seminar series. Like almost everything else in academia, it was pushed online by the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the fact that we really miss being in a seminar room full of interesting people, Alan and I have been amazed by the advantages of this format. The most important one, of course, is the privilege of having all of you here. A fantastic group of people that seems to be growing in number and diversity from one event to the other. As usual, I would like to thank the people who have made this possible. Rupert Younger, Director of the CCR, Sarah Livingstone, Chris Page, and Mark Hughes Morgan. Thank you all for your support, enthusiasm, and hard work. And of course, I am particularly grateful to Alan, whose expertise, experience, and I must say infinite patience have been crucial to the existence and success of the seminar series. Now, today's seminar addresses a very important and timely question about the role of business in society, which is something that we're also trying to understand here at the center. There is quite a lot of confusion about the relationship between business responsibility for human rights and corporate social responsibility. They might seem incredibly similar, but there are big conceptual differences that we need to understand if there is to be any progress. Florian is going to help us to understand how we got to the point where we are today, very close to the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and at a time when everyone in every sector is talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. He's going to discuss the tensions between these two developments in corporate responsibility, and he's going to help us to make sense of the implications of those tensions for current practice and future achievements. Florian will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes, during which time he will respond to clarification questions only. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. So please enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box, and either Alan or I will relay them to Florian. You can find the Q&A button either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you are using. And as usual, we're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. Florian, thank you so much for being here today and for helping us to make sense of such an important and difficult question. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. So that should work. I hope that everybody can see. All right, I think that works. So thank you very much, Rita, for the very nice and humbling introduction. It's a big pleasure and honor. just wanted to say to be here, but I'm in my office, of course. So, but speaking to through the filter of my screen, speaking to this Zoom audience. So thank you very much for the invitation. As you already announced, so this talk is about some of the, maybe less about the conceptual differences between business and human rights and CSR, than about, I think, what we now see emerged at the practical implications of those conceptual differences. So I'm trying to kind of especially point to one instance where we, I think, see that those conceptual differences actually matter in practice. And I will talk about two broad developments, major developments, I think, in the larger domain of corporate responsibility, the business and human rights BHR movement and the sustainable development goals of the UN, the SDGs. Though the focus is heavily on business and human rights, and I'll fold in the SDGs here and there, but the main focus is on BHR, and especially the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, the UNGPs. And I will introduce those two developments a little more closely shortly, in case there are people in the audience who are not entirely familiar with them. So, but I won't spend too much time doing that. What's interesting, I think, about those movements is that if you look at the business and human rights movement and the UNGPs, and as well as the developments that follow the UNGPs, I think aims more at kind of increasing and tightening corporate accountability, reining in corporations in some sense, whereas the SDGs certainly has more focus on expanding corporate responsibility, on enhancing the role also of corporations for proactive engagement, for sustainable development. So seemingly there's a push and a pull in different directions, but what we've seen certainly is that CSR has been kind of the avenue, which is, I call it here, caught in the middle to a certain extent, which has been kind of the driver that has pushed these developments into the corporations for implementation and so on. And I think now, as implementation continues, I think what we see is some inconsistencies that start to emerge, and sometimes really quite acutely. And one of those instances I would like to talk about today. Though I do see this one development more as a symptom of a larger underlying discrepancy and mismatch, perhaps, between CSR and the broader business and human rights movement. Perhaps it's important to give you some context about how this presentation kind of evolved. So this is not a presentation that is based on a kind of a polished scholarly paper or expose, if you will, but more observations and thoughts, particularly that are connected to my role, the involvement in the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, whose campaign ran between 2015 and 2020. And perhaps also kind of connected to a certain frustration that this involvement brought with it, with the role that CSR played in the lead up to the national referendum in Switzerland on that initiative. And of course, I do fold in, of course, certain conceptual thoughts that you can find in various papers that I've written before. But it's really, and I think that's important to mention, it's really based on personal also observations that I made, and as such certainly not set in stone in that sense, but I think perhaps interesting to give an input also for discussion later on. So it's an attempt to make also conceptual sense of those kind of observations. Briefly, maybe the outline of what you can expect in the next, I would say probably closer to 25 minutes than to 20. First, after this introduction, I'll briefly, as I said, introduce the two developments, SDGs and BHR or the UNGPs. And then I would spend the bulk of the presentation reflecting on CSR as kind of an implementation device for those two developments, particularly for the UNGPs, and try to conceptualize the process that we can see where along which this implementation unfolds as a process of domestication, co-optation, and confrontation. I will then ask basically the question if there is something like enlightened CSR, which can overcome perhaps the discrepancies that we see, and then end with some implications and conclusions, which is more kind of an open question to really give an input for discussion perhaps afterwards. So those who are not familiar with the UNGPs or business and human rights more generally, the discussion starts to emerge as a discussion, also a scholarly discourse, I guess, in the late 1980s, but really takes off in the 1990s, mid-1990s. Very often, the takeoff of the discussion is connected to particularly the role of extractive companies in Nigeria and in the Niger Delta, and even more specifically to the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the leader of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people back in 1995. It's an interdisciplinary discussion by now that spans various disciplines, but it's very heavily driven, I think, by the legal discipline, still today and always was in some sense. And I think this has to do also with the focus of the business and human rights debate, which is on also conceptual questions surrounding human rights responsibilities of corporations, but perhaps even more predominantly on accountability of business and accountability structures also surrounding businesses to hold them accountable for human rights violations that they commit or are involved and contributing to. When I say the discussion took off in the 1990s, that doesn't mean that before that, business and human rights didn't exist in a sense. But of course, the precursors of the business and human rights debate reach much further back than that. So certainly to the local struggles of for example, the Ogoni in Nigeria and other local injustices and the struggle for access to justice. Some would even connect it back to the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. So holding industrialists, not the corporation itself, but industrialists in their role for corporations accountable for contributing and being complicit in atrocities. And we've also seen a kind of a progressive institutionalization of business and human rights that started to emerge in the 1970s, for example, the UN draft code back then, or the OECD guidelines in 1976, I believe, that has kind of developed and evolved all the way to where we are now. We had the Global Compact, for example, with 2 human rights principles in the year 2000. We had the UN draft norms between 1998 and 2003. But for us today, important is especially the mandate of Special Representative at the UN for Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie, who was appointed to that position in 2005. And then the mandate expired in 2011 with the publication of the guiding principles, which very quickly became the authoritative framework in business and human rights, which I would say not even only practice and policy is referring to as an authoritative framework, but very often also scholarship, at least as an authoritative reference point or something like that. So it plays a very, very important role also in business and human rights scholarship. And for those who are not familiar with the UNGPs, you see the 3 pillars there on the slide. So they're based on 3 pillars: the state duty to protect people from corporate abuse or human rights violations committed by corporations or contributed to by corporations. That's a legally binding duty, which is grounded in international law. And then we have call it a non-legal responsibility of corporations to respect human rights, understood as a responsibility not to violate human rights or not to do harm. And the 3rd pillar is the necessity to improve access to remedy which is a task that is to some degree shared by states and corporations. And that's pretty much all we need to know, I think, to then move on to look at the implementation. Very briefly, before that, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, is a part of the Agenda 2030 of the UN for Sustainable Development. The goals are basically a successor of the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in the year 2000 and expired in 2015. Though the SDGs are much more comprehensive in a sense than the MDGs were. They're based on 17 broad goals, which are subdivided in 169 targets, which then the progress can be measured by, I think it's more than 200 indicators. And so they span a variety of different dimensions, such as no poverty, gender equality, for example, even climate change is in there, access to clean water, and so on and so forth. The SDGs address primarily governments, but explicitly also the private sector as a key partner in the realization of the goals. So it's very prominent and clear in the SDGs that the achievement of those goals hinges not least on the contribution of the private sector, such as corporations. What they don't do, and there I think they differ from the UNGPs quite a bit, is assign actual responsibilities. While they do refer to and address actors such as governments and businesses as contributors and actors in the SDG realization, they do not actually assign any specific responsibilities to them. The UNGPs certainly are different in that sense. Nevertheless, despite, or maybe because of this, the SDGs have become a very powerful narrative, I think, especially for the coordination of the sustainability agenda, not just of the public sector, but also of the private sector, of corporations. So many corporations in their, for example, CSR reports would today refer to the SDGs as the overarching framework that somehow structures and coordinates their CSR activity. And so this is already the segue basically to CSR, the role of CSR in the implementation of those movements. I think they have become the main implementation device of both of them. The UNGPs, if you look at them, they're fairly vague on implementation. For governments, they state that government should implement a smart mix of measures, meaning a smart mix of both voluntary and mandatory measures, both in the policy space and in the legislative space, but also in adjudication, for example. But importantly here is the UNGPs do include mandatory measures, legislation, as one avenue with which states should implement their duty to protect human rights. Companies, on the other hand, I think implementation remains vague. The human rights due diligence, HRDD, there on the slide, is the main tool with which the corporations ought to discharge basically their responsibility to respect human rights. What is interesting is that if you look through the UNGPs and you search for CSR, you will not find anything. So the UNGPs do not actually mention CSR at all. Nevertheless, and research shows this, and Draghi himself also conducted some studies, I think, with that direction. And that's also not very surprising, is that the majority of companies use existing CSR structures and frames, not only to make sense of human rights, but also to really kind of implement the UNGPs. So that is the framework, and so the CSR managers in that sense are the persons most responsible, I guess, for coordinating those efforts. Same for the SDGs. I think the CSR frame there is even more intuitive than for the UNGPs, because they are largely discretionary, because they do adopt this positive outlook for company engagement, and because there's also no clear hierarchy between those goals. So it leaves lots of leeway for companies to in some sense pick and choose and structure their existing activities around those SDGs. And as I said, so they have become a powerful frame for and reference point for CSR efforts, and also for governments, in a sense. If you read through the implementation reports that governments issue for the SDGs, interestingly, they do not very often refer to business and human rights if they address corporations as partners, but very frequently to CSR. So also governments perceive CSR as a platform and avenue through which the SDGs are being implemented in the private sector. So, and I mentioned that already to some degree. So it looks like CSR representative departments have really become the internal hubs in corporations for coordinating both business and human rights and SDGs efforts. Another question, of course, and that's a question I asked in this presentation, is that a problem? And it can, I think, be perceived as a problem because there is a certain, if you look at it from a conceptual point of view, there is a certain conceptual mismatch between CSR and human rights, particularly if you look at CSR more as kind of, you know, how it's conventionally understood and how it's often also understood in practice. So conventional CSR and Cher and Palazzo have shown this nicely in their research about political CSR. The conventional understanding of CSR usually based on a sharp distinction between private and public domain, so that the classic liberal view on the sharp divide between what is to be considered private and what is to be considered public. And of course, corporations belong to the private domain, whereas everything that is public is in the responsibility of governments. And as such, also, if you think about corporate responsibility through that lens, it is conceptualized as private responsibility. And I would say there's at least 4 central elements that characterize an understanding of corporate social responsibility as private responsibility. On the one hand, it's the voluntariness of it, that it's not mandated kind of through the public sector. It's apolitical nature, meaning that corporations do not bear any responsibility for public concerns because the state is responsible for those, unless, of course, those concerns or those domains are privatized. That means they're transferred into the domain of private responsibility. There, as a consequence, I would say, tend to be corporate-centric. So the corporations are in the driving seat of prioritizing, for example, issues. So that's largely left to corporate discretion of what issues they address and what the priorities are that they attach to them. And because that's the case, I think they also tend to be fairly instrumental in outlook, so that those issues are being prioritized that have a more direct impact also on corporate interests. So those I would say are some of the elements that characterize CSR understood as private responsibility. And that, of course, has implications if you look at human rights through the lens of corporate social responsibility as private responsibility. It means that human rights responsibility then as a part of CSR is also understood as a private matter, rather than understanding corporate responsibility as a public or political matter. So you pull human rights into the private realm rather than the other way around, pushing corporate responsibility into the public domain. And so this conceptual discrepancy can have big, I think, practical implications. And we've seen that already back in the discussion around the UN draft norms in between 1998 and 2003, when the International Employers Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce, as some of the more outspoken business association against the UN draft norms, argued exactly along those lines when they say, look, we don't want this framework because that would amount to a privatization of human rights. And I think this makes clear why they would argue that way, because they were interpreting business and or human rights responsibility through the lens of CSR as a private responsibility tool. So they thought, okay, this is going to pull human rights into the private domain, and we don't want this to happen. Rather than thinking corporate responsibility further into the public realm and drawing the implications from that. So in contrast, business and human rights has always advocated for extending public accountability for human rights into the private realm. So if you extend corporate responsibility and see it as something public, then it is only a small step to conclude that there needs to be public accountability attached to that human rights responsibility, rather than extending private responsibility into the domain of human rights. And I think it's exactly this point that we see is becoming kind of at the point of tension in practice today. So I think this the one that the sentence that I boldened there, I think that's a key insight to kind of understand the dynamics that are unfolding today in practice. And I briefly want to talk about this, especially with one example. That's just the Responsible Business Initiative in Switzerland. So what we have seen in the past, say, 4 or 5 years, is a strong push across, especially Western European nations, for mandatory human rights due diligence. So legislation that would mandate that corporation implement human rights due diligence processes. We've seen such a law emerge in France, has been adopted already, the vigilance law in France. There's the child labor due diligence law in the Netherlands. The UK has the Modern Slavery Act, for example. Germany will have a Lieferkettengesetz, a human rights due diligence law, has been announced. The EU will have such legislation, or will issue such legislation this year. And just yesterday, the European Parliament adopted a report that will be sent to the European Commission for this. Switzerland will have such a law, although the watered-down version of the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, and so on and so forth. There's many other initiatives and campaigns going on around Europe. What is striking is, but maybe not that surprising, is how fierce the opposition of the private sector is against those mandatory human rights due diligence laws or their proposals. Even from companies that have actually endorsed the UNGPs originally, have put their weight behind the UNGPs, and the UNGPs clearly, as I mentioned before, clearly include legislation as one part of the smart mix, right? So if endorsing the UNGPs means endorsing the idea of a smart mix that governments will implement to make sure that corporations respect human rights. And those same corporations are now advocating against mandatory human rights due diligence. So now that the things are becoming more concrete, they seem to have shifted in position. And the observation that I made is that increasingly CSR has turned into a reference point in terms of the arguments that the opposition uses to counter those movements towards mandatory human rights due diligence. And a case in point is the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative, which, as I said before, I had a look from the inside with my involvement in that initiative. And what I noticed is just that the longer the campaign went on, the more I found myself on panels, but on opposite sides, with CSR representatives, for example, arguing against mandatory human rights due diligence, when previously, when it really was about the UNGPs and voluntary action, we would sit on the same side of the panel. So there was a divergence there, which I found very peculiar. And it goes along, I think, with a recalibration of arguments that happened during the campaign or the counter campaign, which ran, as I said before, for about 5 years. So previously, and those arguments did not disappear, of course, but previously the argumentation, I think, were more based on what I call here efficiency arguments. So that they say, you know, mandatory human rights due diligence, or the RBI more specifically, they would undermine competitiveness of the Swiss companies, and it's such a competitiveness of Switzerland as such as an industrial hub. Companies would leave Switzerland, and that would affect our welfare. Things like this. So I call this opposition from outside, because those are arguments that are not connected to the responsibility of companies. But then I think there was a shift, even though, as I said, those arguments did not completely disappear, but more and more, I think the argument became that the RBI is not undermining necessarily competitiveness of the companies, but it's undermining its ability to meet its responsibilities. It's undermining the CSR engagement of those companies. It makes it risky, for example, for companies to engage on the ground, because they might face liability if they do so. And so the argument, basically, the underlying argument was that RBI is not incompatible with the profit motive of the company anymore, because that's a tough argument. It's a tough sell, right? It's a tough argument to make if you're arguing against a human rights initiative, to say we don't want this because it might actually make us less competitive and less profitable. An easier argument to make is we don't want this because we believe it's incompatible with the very business and human rights agenda that the initiative actually wants to promote, right? So it's counterproductive in and of itself. And that's what I call opposition from within. And so I wondered what exactly was going on, how to, you know, what kind of process leads to this recalibration of arguments. And I would describe this as a process of what I call domestication, cooptation, and ultimately confrontation. So in the first phase of UNGPs implementation, I think we saw that, and I mentioned that CSR was really the avenue that was used, existing CSR structures, to implement business and human rights into UNGPs. So CSR was really a facilitator of the business and human rights agenda. I think was mostly also seen as a facilitator of this agenda. But with it, of course, a certain domestication of business and human rights into those existing CSR structures and frames happened, and as such also a reinterpretation and the reframing of that business and human rights agenda. So there's a certain cooptation, I think, that happened through that process of domestication, and I call this here from smart mix to quick fix. So the smart, what was originally thought as a smart mix of mandatory and voluntary measures, was reinterpreted as a mix only of voluntary measures, and turning the mandatory part into being counterproductive for the business and human rights agenda. And what makes it difficult, I think, is because though through the domestication, CSR representatives were all of a sudden speaking as expert, or even the gatekeepers for this business and human rights agenda, right? They were the experts on how business and human rights is best being implemented in corporations. Of course, the reframed business and human rights agenda, right? They were the experts of implementation of human rights through a CSR frame. And this is, I think, where the confrontation now comes from, confrontation of the mandatory measures that are now being pushed, first and foremost by civil society, not by the governments, but by civil society, that are now being framed as being counterproductive to the very business and human rights agenda itself. So there's a certain delegitimization that comes with of those mandatory measures. And CSR has turned into what I perceive more as an obstruction to the business and human rights agenda than a facilitation. And if we look at the SDGs, it's interesting because the SDGs have played a similar role in that sense. They have been actively promoted also in the RBI campaign or counter campaign as an alternative to business and human rights, as kind of a counter narrative to the business and human rights movement, also with the argument that mandatory human rights due diligence would undermine corporate contributions to the realization of the SDGs. That if we implement those kind of laws, that would actually make things worse, because then corporations will not have the freedom anymore to really pursue the realization of the SDGs. And I think this is a manifestation of the very same co-optation that we see for the business and human rights agenda, right? Because ultimately, I think corporate respect for human rights is not only a condition, but a key contributing factor to SDGs realization. You can't realize those goals if you can't make sure that corporations respect human rights in the first instance. And so corporate accountability, I think, is a critical condition based on which we can even only start thinking about SDGs realization. So SDGs are, in my view, not a counter-narrative, but an extension of business and human rights paradigm. And I have to speed up a little bit because I see that time is running. So this process, or what I perceive as this process of domestication, co-optation, and confrontation, reminds me of the warnings and criticism that especially critical management scholarship has issued a long time ago, that they have said CSR, that the goal of CSR was never really to transform business towards more responsibility. It was never meant to be an instrument to really kind of transform markets and corporations, but it was more meant to be an instrument to legitimize the business as usual, in a sense. It's a tool to solidify the neoliberal capitalist agenda, and so they've seen the CSR more as a Trojan horse, right? As a tool that can solidify and also counteract real responsibility movements from within by providing a flawed alternative in some sense. And business and human rights scholars too have very early on countered the idea that CSR or that business and human rights is seen as a subset or just an issue of CSR. Business and human rights scholars all along have made the argument that business and human rights is more of a critique of CSR than a subset of it, precisely because of the perceived lack of impact that CSR has had in the past 30 years, and seeing that business and human rights could provide an alternative to this, and a more forceful accountability focused alternative to CSR. And very often this has been kind of dismissed as academic hair split, right? Why would we kind of parse out the conceptual differences between those two movements? But I think this is exactly what we see. We see the practical implications of this today. So we see that this is not just academic hair splitting, but that the differences between those two, call it mentalities, are really starting to play out now that we're 10 years into the implementation of the UNGPs. And I'm slowly coming to an end now, trying to come fast to an end because of the time. There's of course a question, is there something like enlightened CSR? And there has been a growing number of companies that have started to vocally support mandatory human rights due diligence. I think we can't dismiss that, and we should actually really also showcase that. So for all those initiatives in many different countries, there are coalitions of corporations that are actually putting their weight behind mandatory human rights due diligence laws. And very often they state, as in the letter here for the European law that is signed by 26 companies that you see on the slide, they very often state something along the line that mandatory human rights due diligence law do not undermine, but they actually promote engagement and impactful action in the realm of human rights responsibility. And of course, by now it's still unclear, I think, what really drives that engagement or that political advocacy of corporations. But I think at least they have seemed to realize perhaps three things, among others perhaps. The first one is they've realized, I think, that they cannot coherently endorse the UNGPs without supporting such laws as an integral part of the business and human rights agenda and of the UNGPs. Mandatory human rights due diligence was always an integral part of the mandatory mix. Maybe not explicitly, but it was very clear that mandatory measures are a part of the UNGPs implementation. So they may have realized that there's an inconsistency there. They may have realized also that corporate responsibility, and particularly corporate integrity, has always a public and a political dimension to it, and that corporate responsibility can simply not be limited to just private conduct without reflecting and questioning the frame and the context in which it takes place. And they may have realized also that particularly CSR as a function and corporate compliance as a function are internally working as two silos in a sense that need to be broken down and integrated better. And if we start to integrate those different silos within the corporation, that there might be a more holistic, or might emerge a more holistic understanding of not just corporate responsibility, but also how it intersects with laws pushing for a corporate accountability. So that brings me to my last slide, the conclusion. Is it time to part ways with CSR? So that's what the title of the presentation insinuated. And of course, I could just say yes, but maybe slightly more nuanced. I think if we look into the past, I think we can safely say that CSR has certainly not led to the kind of improvements that we hoped they would after 40 years of kind of pushing, or even more than that, pushing a CSR agenda. I think if you look into the future, I'm highly doubtful that CSR is an avenue that can really drive those two major developments that inevitably will shape corporate responsibility, BHR and the SDGs. Not sure if CSR is the right avenue to be pushing this into the corporation. And so my conclusion is that really now is the time to think fundamentally, and I really mean in a fundamental sense, about alternative organizing forms for corporate responsibility. Perhaps political CSR, BHR, SDGs, those kind of movements, they can be starting points for this reflection, and they can lead to certain incremental changes, such as, for example, the CSR compliance interface in the shorter run. But I think in the long run, I think there's no way around really radically new ideas about how we can organize corporate responsibility. And of course, you could say, well, we just abolish corporations altogether. I'm not sure if that's the conclusion I want to end with, but if we leave them in place, I think we need to really think outside of the box and think about new ideas of how we can structure and organize corporate responsibility around those institutions. So that would take me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening slightly more than the announced 30 minutes, and hopefully there will be some good comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Florian. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and reflection with us. It was very, very interesting, and questions and comments are starting to pour in. As you know, please use the Q&A function to type your questions and comments. Before we go into those, I'll just ask you a very quick question of my own. So at the very beginning, you talked about the fact that the business and human rights debate has been so closely related to the legal debate and the legal frameworks and the legal foundations. And my question to you for now is, do you think lawyers have caused this sort of dysfunction in terms of language, in terms of engagement, in terms of commitment? Do you think that an excessive attachment to legal frameworks is part of why we are where we are today?
Well, I think siloing of academic discussion certainly is one reason for this kind of disconnect and perhaps also the divergence. But I also wouldn't necessarily say that lawyers are only attached to legal frameworks in terms of holding corporations accountable. I often feel that lawyers have a you know, not being a lawyer myself, have a much broader view on what kind of accountability mechanisms could be impactful, other than just law and so on, right? But I think that there's certainly a siloing and the need for bridging the two debate, but that holds for both, for the academic, legally driven debate and the CSR debate, which has perhaps not taken, well, they certainly taken note of the business and human rights debate, but perhaps not engaged with the business and human rights debate to the extent that they should, also in order to become conversational with exactly those lawyers that you address here.
Alan, I think you have a question. You look intrigued.
I was going to ask a question that Grant Roseboom's typed into the Q&A, which I guess you could interpret as also being about siloing, but in a slightly different way. It's quite a long question and it's incredibly well expressed, so I'm just going to read it out. He says, do you think that some of what explains the inadequacy of CSR for business and human rights is that CSR and business and human rights concern different normative domains? He says, perhaps CSR is best understood as dealing with political and moral rights or interests that don't count as human rights. And perhaps we need to have a more circumspect view of human rights. And then he says, perhaps there should be a division of labour, not because CSR is wholly private and subject to corporate discretion, but because protecting political and moral rights that are not human rights is importantly different than from protecting human rights. Do you think there's anything in that?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the reasons, right? That CSR scholars also, but also perhaps practitioners, have a different understanding of those kind of rights. And if they think about human rights, they first and foremost think about exactly the human rights as a moral category, not necessarily about the institutionalization of human rights. And as such, they may simply also not see a pressing need to address the responsibilities that derive from those moral rights as human rights, because they may perceive it as fairly uncontroversial that those kind of issues need to be addressed in some sense, and may also not think about the main issue, I think, that drives the business human rights debate. If you come from an institutional point of view, the fact that institutionalized human rights address governments and not necessarily business. And so there's still a large conceptual task ahead of us to show that human rights in an institutional sense should not only address governments, but also business and what the implications are for them. So it may come natural to them to address them in some sense, but not address them as human rights. But I also think the failure of addressing them as human rights comes with a lack of normative urgency, if you will, of addressing them, and thus maybe come with a certain discretion in terms of what you address and what you don't address. Also with not seeing a problem, for example, in instrumentalizing certain responsibilities for human rights. So I think even if you address them as moral rights, and even if you approach human rights through a moral lens, I think that the terminology as such comes with a normativity that is important for the discourse.
Thank you. Rita.
Yeah, Alicia Shivji asked a very interesting question here. So Alicia is wondering if we should be concerned that mandatory human rights due diligence might also act as a Trojan horse. And so Alicia says, if the companies conducted due diligence themselves, aren't we further empowering them to create their own truth? How will human rights due diligence be enforced? So she worries that too much emphasis is being placed on passing the laws without really addressing monitoring and enforcement procedures, which is actually one of the biggest problems with most of the soft law initiatives out there to begin with. What do you think about this?
Yes, absolutely. Whether Trojan horse is the right terminology here, perhaps, But of course, it's all about how those laws ultimately look like, and exactly what the enforcement mechanism and the accountability mechanism is that is attached to those laws, right? And interesting, I mean, I was speaking mostly about the responsible business initiative, which the mandatory human rights or the due diligence obligation was attached to a fairly far-reaching accountability mechanism, which was one of the reasons, of course, why it was so fiercely opposed by corporations, and was one of the reasons why ultimately it was watered down to a law with almost no accountability enforcement mechanism. That's the law that is now being adopted in Switzerland. And what we see also, for example, in Germany, right, where the proposal for the Lieferkettengesetz was much more forceful than the law that was ultimately adopted, because it was watered down in the last moment. And of course, that's not the kind of law that you can possibly support as the end of the story, right? And there certainly is a danger that in the end we adopt laws that will not really have an actual impact.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay, there's a question here from Judith Schrempf-Sterling that occurred to me as you were speaking. She says she's intrigued by what you said about CSR never really being meant to work. She says it was, it was at its core a management tool and so a Trojan horse. And she wonders if that's applicable to CSR practice, or is there really a fundamental flaw in CSR theory? And if there's already a flaw in the theory, what would a theory of the firm have to look like to make the necessary changes possible in practice?
Well, I think there is a discrepancy between the ideal and that's probably more the theory. And I think many scholars who do scholarship in corporate responsibility might not even call it CSR necessarily, but corporate responsibility, are generally interested in corporate responsibility that actually works and has an impact and does transform corporations in a certain sense. But I think that is not the kind of CSR that we've seen in practice in the past 30 years. And so I think there's a discrepancy between us doing scholarship in a somewhat idealized way of what we believe that corporate social responsibility is or ought to be, and what we actually see happening in practice. And I think in practice, it has always been driven by a much more forceful imperative to generate profits and maximize profits by corporation. As such, the corporate social responsibility organization, of course, had to be kind of shaped along those much more forceful principles within corporations. So I think that I see the Trojan horse mostly as CSR as a practical tool and the way it is de facto implemented in corporations, rather than what scholarship has to say about corporate social responsibility, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Rita.
Well, we don't have a lot of time left and there are a lot of questions here, so I'm going to try to roll 3 of them into one. Quite a lot of people here are wondering about the role of ESG in all of this, and whether ESG assessments, which might include human rights related risk analysis, are influencing this discourse. Could they be a viable alternative to CSR? What's your view on ESG?
Well, I think it's becoming more influential, and I think they are picking up on human rights quite rapidly. And so if we look at also scholarship in this area, I think this will become a very forceful and important driver of business and human rights, or also corporate social responsibility that takes human rights to some degree seriously. The question, of course, and I think it's hard to tell where, what the ultimate impact will be of ESG investment in driving those agendas, whether it will remain some more kind of a I think it's out of the niche, but to what degree it can be mainstream to really kind of have this large scale impact that we actually need to have you know, business and human rights organizations that have an impact on the ground, an actual impact on the ground for the people whose rights are violated, very often in the global south. And I guess we'll see. I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle, but in and of itself, I think it's not going to be enough. Just hope that investment in ESG investment will do the trick. I think we do need the implementation through legislation, and by that I mean, to come back to the question before, by that I mean legislation that really is enforced and has powerful mechanisms where also victims of human rights violations can sue corporations in their home states and actually have a chance to succeed with those kind of lawsuits. I think it is inevitable that we implement those laws to actually make business and human rights a movement that ultimately has an impact.
Thank you. Alan, a quick one, please.
Okay, this is probably going to be the last question. I hope you can answer it reasonably quickly. Constance Wagner has asked two very closely related questions about corporate fear of legal liability. So if opposition to mandatory human rights disclosure, due diligence regimes is based on a corporate fear of legal liability, number one, are those fears well-founded? Number two, are lawyers obliged by their professional responsibility to counsel clients in a way that possibly causes some of the phenomena that you're addressing in your talk?
I think those fears can be well-founded depending on what the law looks like that is being implemented, right? So in Switzerland, and now I'm kind of starting a long answer, which I'm exactly not supposed to do. in Switzerland, one argument that the corporations made was that you know, if the RBI is implemented, then they can't engage on the ground especially in the global south anymore, especially exactly in those kind of areas in which it is needed the most, corporate engagement, because the liability risk will be too high for them to go there. So they will pull out, and in the end, everybody is worse off. But the law that the Responsible Business Initiative proposed actually accounted for that insofar as if corporations can show, that would have been the idea, if corporations can show that they have actually done their due diligence and they operate with all due care in those kind of areas, they could basically exonerate themselves from liability. So they free themselves from liability. So setting basically an incentive to stay there, but staying there with doing the things right, right? So in that sense, for this particular initiative, I think it's a strawman argument to say that RBI would have undercut them in their engagement. I think it's the opposite. I think it incentivized actual engagement on the ground. But of course, I think laws that do not have those kind of elements in place, I could see that there are designs of laws where such an argument could be correct. Right?
Well, thank you so much, Florian, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been absolutely great. I'm delighted that we were able to have Florian here with us today and that we were able to have this conversation. This is the last seminar of the term, but we will have new dates to announce very soon for the next term, so keep an eye on your email inboxes. And until then, thank you, stay safe, and I hope to see you all soon. Thanks again, Florian.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.